How do you think of the build versus buy paradigm in the age of AI? Same with like open source, where things now can be kind of built easily or trivially.
I'm very biased. In my mind, if you don't treat security as an engineering problem, you're not likely to succeed. I'm not saying don't use them, but they can't be the foundation of your security program.
What do you think the open source ecosystem will look like in the age of AI, where it could become trivial to write code on the fly and maybe not necessarily have so many third-party dependencies?
And the model had decided to completely ignore the abstractions that I had built and was just, writing raw express code.
If offense and defense both get the same cheap orchestratable AI, who do you think actually comes out ahead?
This really stupid example that I have is that say you have a house with 10 doors and you lock 9 of them. Are you now 90% secure? Right? And the answer is no.
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Niels Provos. Niels, thanks for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, I've been wanting to chat with you for a while. I'll be honest. I came across one of your blog posts in my LinkedIn feed about finding 0 days, essentially with any model, aside from the frontier models, as kind of have dominated the headlines. And I caught you on Risky Biz, the podcast, for an excellent discussion there. So I hounded you down, via Signal and some other means, and I'm excited to chat with you today. But for folks that don't know you and your background, can you tell us a bit about yourself before we dive into things?
Yeah, totally. I've been in the security space, I guess, for over 25 years now. Started studying math and physics, then did a PhD in computer science at the University of Michigan in the US. Ended up at Google for many, many years, where I helped manage a lot of the security engineering teams during that time. We also get Operation Aurora, where Google got compromised by actors, based by the Chinese, backed by the Chinese government. And then I was head of security at Stripe for a little bit more than 3.5 years, was at Lacework, and now I'm basically enjoying just pursuing my own passion projects.
Yeah, and this is a pretty exciting time to do that with all the, the emerging technology, the frontier labs, the open source models, agents, all the things they're in. I was curious, to kick us off, you've spent decades in this space, as you said, from writing bcrypt to running security at Google and Stripe, and now you're deep in the weeds of AI and vulnerability research, which I know we're going to go in the weeds on a lot of that stuff. But what pulled you towards AI's effect on vulnerability discovery as a problem that kind of caught your attention?
So, as I just mentioned to you in our sort of pre-discussion, one of the things I end up doing is producing cybersecurity themed electronic dance music under Activate. And when Anthropic released their Mythos Red Team report, that was on April 7th, I was at University of Michigan giving a talk about Iron Curtain, but it was also the 12th-year anniversary of the OpenSSL Heartbleed vulnerability, and we just released the Heartbleed track. And so I, dropped it to a couple of reporter friends, and one of them said, "Oh, I'm just writing this article about vulnerabilities. What do you know about Mythos?" And so I started reading it, realized that sort of the marquee finding that they had was this 27-year-old vulnerability in OpenBSD that I was responsible for. And it sort of made me wonder, models were already incredibly powerful prior to Mythos. And I know that, there are plenty of startups that were already in that space before then who were successful at finding and exploiting vulnerabilities. What would it take to do that with lesser models? And with Iron Curtain, I had already worked on this notion of finite state machine driven workflows that help you minimize context, that help you with sort of, long horizon prompt following in some sense. And I'd done that mostly to get a faster design and implement loop for myself. But it actually turned out not to be too much work to turn this around into a vulnerability finding workflow. And ultimately, I just wanted to show that you don't need the latest and greatest models to find vulnerabilities very, very quickly, and that it was not really a threshold moment, right? The concern that adversaries may find vulnerabilities en masse was already a problem, 6 months prior to that.
Yeah, and that kind of takes me to where I was going to ask you next is myself and others and have been using phrases like, Vulnpocalypse or Bugageddon or whatever, these funny phrases that we're saying is kind of defines the time that we're in right now to describe AI industrializing vulnerability discovery and collapsing the time of from discovery to weaponization. From where you're sitting, is that framing accurate? Is it overstated? Or, how do you think it's all coming together when you look at AI's intersection with vulnerability management and like autonomous exploitation, the models discovering vulnerabilities, et cetera?
Well, as we all know, hyperbole leads to a lot of engagement, and engagement is what everybody is looking for. So I think it is true that we're living in a time where progress seems to be accelerating. Sort of the time between a major breakthrough ends up becoming slower. And if you've sort of been reading about, Anthropic lately, they have been talking a lot about this recursive self-improvement, which will sort of likely even further speed up sort of the rate of progress. But I think in terms of the vulnerability discussion, I thought this notion of Bugmageddon, while it's, a very catchy way to talk about it, is overstated. Right? Companies already sit on more vulnerabilities than they know how to manage, right? And now there are more. It doesn't really significantly change the picture in my mind, because vulnerability management clearly is an important discipline, but it can't be the only way that you deal with that. And that is why I was writing about we need structural guarantees that just eliminate the ability for some of these vulnerabilities to be exploited successfully.
Yeah, it's a concept you describe as security invariants. I was going to ask you about that. I was curious though, you make a great point. Like, we're already sitting on vulnerability backlogs in hundreds of thousands to millions in large enterprises, depending on what numbers you believe and so on. And it seems to have accelerated the aspect of discovery and potentially weaponization. But on the other end, of course, is remediation. And that's like the bottleneck that AI hasn't solved or made trivial yet. Like, how do you think of remediation right now, and maybe where it may go with the use of AI? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I mean, my sense is that remediation is going to be much easier with AI tooling as well. We just have not really seen, very compelling offerings for that yet. And in some sense, I wish that sort of the frontier labs and the big tech companies spend more time on making that kind of tooling available. But I expect that there is going to be, open source tooling available on that. I believe I just came across something today where maybe Visa ended up offering some tooling to help with remediation. And in many ways, the challenge with remediation is really am I breaking code that used to work? If I put this in my production environment, is everything still working the way that it was working before? Or am I all of a sudden going to be creating a lot of outages that weren't there before, right? So I think it is a much harder quality bar to reach. But, hopefully with the AI tooling and sort of good steering, we can significantly improve test coverage. We might be able to roll these things out sort of, in some kind of, green-blue deployment where you sort of monitor it, but it's much more costly, right? It's more time consuming. On the other hand of that though, so much of the companies rely on open source tooling, and lots of these open source maintainers don't have access to the latest, greatest AI model or tooling, or can't afford to, pay for the tokens. And there I really feel we need to come up with a way to empower those maintainers much, much more than before, because we are all reaping the benefit of that, right? Years and decades of free work that, powers, the largest companies in the industry.
Yeah, you said a few things that make me think of some parallel like publications and research and such. Like, there's a great paper called The Tragedy of the Digital Commons from a researcher that I've shared in the past, Chinmayi Sharma is her name. And she talks about kind of this tragedy of the digital commons where we're exhausting a free good in open source. And that's been like a large argument of where open source is headed. I saw someone post today that, and again, to your hyperbole comment, like open source is dead, right? Because AI can rewrite or write anything on the fly and, those kind of things. How do you react when you hear that? Like, what do you think the open source ecosystem will look like in the age of AI, where it could become trivial to write, code on the fly and maybe not necessarily have so many third-party dependencies or things like that? How do you think of that whole kind of conversation?
I worry about that too. I mean, basically for the last 30 years, I've, heavily relied on open source and contributed to it as well, with OpenSSH and other projects. But for myself, right, I can clearly see there's an open source library. I need a tiny fraction of that functionality, and the right functionality is not quite there, so I would have to extend it slightly. Is it going to be easier for me to do that in that open source library and send a pull request? Or is it just easier to ask the AI tool, here's the functionality that I want, just re-implement it for me? And I mean, in many ways, if you don't have to take the third-party dependency, that also means if vulnerabilities are being found in that third-party dependency, they don't apply to you. There's also perhaps something to be said, but I don't know if anybody has sort of done scientific research on that. You know how, homogeneity in the software deployment makes it so that vulnerabilities apply very, very broadly. If we get to a much more diverse ecosystem of software, sort of, maybe vulnerabilities will not be as widely distributed, but it sort of, begs the question on whether the AI models just produce the same type of vulnerabilities in, whatever custom code they end up writing. In my mind, though, there are some amazing open source projects, and these open source projects are amazing in my mind because they have displayed so much taste in interfaces and abstractions. And that taste, at least in my opinion, cannot be easily replaced by AI models at the moment. I'm a huge fan of Svelte 5. It's a modern, front-end stack, and I just love the way that they have designed that. And, I would never go to let's just rewrite it from scratch, because it's just so good as it is already.
Yeah, it's that whole topic is really fascinating for various reasons. You talked about I'm not even going to try to use the word homogeneity, like I'll butcher it, but there's a paper from Dan Geer about this topic, and he talks about Microsoft, I think is the example he used, and which is funny, is they're a much more dominant, pervasive vendor now, arguably, than they were when he wrote the paper. But to your point, the bugs or vulnerabilities become more pervasive and broad because of how pervasive the software is, right? But then at the same time, I could see a situation where the open source, is what has trained these models, and there's research showing that, often the code produced by these models implicitly kind of, perpetuates vulnerabilities because of the open source it was trained on. But then there's also the conversation of who maintains it. If there's a vulnerability in open source and it gets resolved, but you used AI to write your code, it's not open source per se, who maintains it, who kind of, continues to mitigate vulnerabilities that come about over time and all that. That's it's such a fascinating thing to think about of where all of this will go, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and there, in my personal opinion, the sort of, frontier labs still have a lot of work to do with the code that their models end up writing. And that goes a little bit into this notion of security invariants. But you had also seen this article that I had written maybe last year about being very disappointed in the code that was being written for one of my projects. Sort of, my worry is, over the years, we have accumulated a lot of security knowledge on how to do things right. I mean, let's say you put an RPC server somewhere in your production environment. You want to make sure that everything is mutually authenticated, right? You don't want to just open up endpoints to anybody who might have network access to your system. And we can talk about VPCs and IP tables sort of as a separate thing. But I had written this project, for this little startup that I have, Band Alert, which is basically meant to help bands get more fans to their gigs. They scan a QR code, they get an SMS the day before the gig, and then they can show up. And for that, I had asked Claude to write a new endpoint. But because I was already so worried about, this is a production deployment, mostly vibe coded, what security vulnerabilities will I be introducing? I had built these, very carefully constructed abstractions. It uses Node, it uses an Express server, but the Express server is not really exposed. Only a wrapper is exposed that proxies to certain functions. Hang on a second. That proxies to certain functions, but the only way that you can access it from the outside is if you declare an explicitly authenticated route or an unauthenticated route. So it's obvious, what it is that you're looking at. And the model had decided to completely ignore the abstractions that I had built and was just, writing raw Express code. And so I think the same is true for any other kind of AI development that you end up doing. What are the interfaces and abstractions that you put in place that hide the complexity of the underlying code, but also give you the right security boundaries on which you can rely? And I mean, sort of, Google has been on the forefront for this, for decades. Auto-escaping templating libraries. Can we make it so that by default you cannot author SQL injections? Right? That's a framework decisions. And I think the AI models need to get to a place where the frameworks that they end up writing have this taste, where they build interfaces that are secure by default, or that hide the complexity in such a way that it's very difficult to shoot yourself in the foot if you use that interface.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the frontier labs and the model providers do on that front in terms of kind of codifying the concept of secure by design and their opportunity to produce secure code by default, right? Especially as it become the primary vector in which people develop code in the modern environment. You had this blog that caught my attention. The first one I saw is called "Finding Zero Days with Any Model," and you touched on this concept of finite state machines, and you had workflows in there that you talk about, such as Iron Curtain, your Iron Curtain runtime, and use an open weight model. I think it was GLM 5.1 to surface net new 0 days. Can you walk us through like what actually works and why you say this is an orchestration problem rather than a frontier model problem? It seems to be like the harness is the, I've heard people use a phrase like the harness is the moat, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think we shouldn't be simplifying too much, but if you listen to Anthropic talking about Mythos, one of the things that they talk about is how long the model can stay on track with a task, right? If you give it a prompt, for how long can it coherently follow the goals set by that prompt? And Nicholas Carlini, I think, was talking about this at Unprompted earlier in the year. And back then, I don't think he had Mythos on his chart, but he had, Opus 4.6 or 4.7, whatever was out there. And he was sort of saying, well, with that model, it's sort of equivalent to a human staying on track for about 15 hours. But afterwards, sort of all bets are off, and you don't really know where it's going to go. And for the open weight models, that is even truer, right? They struggle with staying really on task for a long period of time. They also struggle with context, right? All these models have limited context. Is basically the amount of information that they can ingest and reason about. And the fuller the context, the worse the reasoning is about the data that you have seen already. And then the other thing that is really important to keep in mind is this notion, what have these models been trained to accomplish? And the models have been largely trained to please you and I. And this notion is, yes, Niels, this is great, wonderful idea. You are so brilliant. And that sort of translates into the coding workflow too, right? They have been trained to complete and finish, and they have to been trained to complete and finish in a time that is, finite. So they might do, 30 rounds, 40 rounds, 50 rounds, but at some point they have to get done. And now, if the model sees the goal that it's aiming for is just so close, it may just decide, I'm just going to go for it, but I ignore everything else that I was being told. That certain tests had to be written, that sort of, validation had to happen in a certain way, and just take the shortcut. And so this idea with this finite state machine workflow is that you can box these models in. Vulnerability finding, you can decompose into, different stages. And, one is sort of usually let's look at what the source code is about. What are sort of the functions that we care about? How do we get to them? What are the entry points? And then based on that understanding, can we form hypotheses about what potential vulnerability must look like? And the interesting thing is, it's sort of a pattern matching kind of thing. You see an array operation that does some integer arithmetic. Well, was there a check before that makes sure that everything stays in bounds? And so the LLMs are pretty good at reasoning that way. And then these finite states are basically just that. Create hypotheses. You can't do anything else because this harness forces you into the, that is what you get to do. You get to write your findings. And then I have this orchestrator that keeps a journal. And then the journal basically says, we just send it to the analysis, the hypothesis stage. Now maybe you should send it to something that builds a harness. And every single time you do that, you start that model with a very specific prompt for that state and with a fresh context. And so you avoid all of the problems that I mentioned before, which is sort of, long horizon prompt following, because now it's a very decomposed problem. You start with a fresh context, so context doesn't pollute as quickly. And because it is a bounded problem, it is okay if the model doesn't compute forever. It's okay if it finishes early. And if you put all of that together, you will find that is actually pretty good at finding new vulnerabilities and validating them, even with models that are not as powerful.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I think you and there were some others at IO, for example, who had published a piece called the Jagged Frontier, I think it was, talking about a similar concept of using open weight and open source models to do some of this activity. It's funny you mentioned Nicholas Carlini, because I was at Unprompted, and he had made a comment at that time, I think, that the models were improving in vulnerability research about every 4.5 months. They were doubling, is what I think he used the metric he used. And then a few other things. There's an organization called Meter that tracks like the long horizon tasks capabilities of the models. Those seem to be improving incredibly quickly. And then there's another side of this, and I apologize if I'm wrong, but I think when I caught you on Risky Biz, you had waded into the waters a little bit of the regulatory kind of conversation to some extent. And so last week we saw an AI executive order in the United States, and that was kind of everyone was kind of long awaiting that to see what would happen, how it would come out. It came out, it was voluntary in nature, but it did establish some things like the NSA, setting out to develop criteria for, quote unquote, what they say, covered frontier models, I think is the phrase, or something like that, that have cyber capabilities, and also established like a vulnerability clearinghouse within CISA and NSA and others. I'm curious your thoughts on like if a scan cost, in your case, like we're using these open weight, open source models, if it costs between $30 and $150, right, to find real 0 days, the argument for restricting, frontier model releases to prevent offensive misuse starts to look maybe not as strong. Where do you land on the conversation of, potentially regulating AI or gating frontier models before release? And what does your research imply about, whether that even would work, given you can do this with other models that are less capable or open source and so on?
Yeah, I mean, as you probably know, I'm not in the camp that is worried about this vulnerability apocalypse. And I mean, there's probably a game theoretic approach where you can sort of, figure out, who benefits the most from each approach. But my worry continues to be, can we please enable the open source maintainers to deal with all of this? Because the amplification factor of them being empowered is just so broad. If they get to fix the vulnerabilities, everybody who relies on these open source libraries or applications benefits from it. Anything that I see making it more difficult for open source maintainers to get ahead, I'm usually not a fan of. But when I was talking about regulation, I was much more talking about the incentives being placed on companies for their responsibility of the security outcomes that they create, right? Because by and large, you find that most companies land in a place where they say, we just have to do enough for security that we don't appear negligent. But otherwise, right, we just gonna drive business. And in many ways, right, you can't blame them for that. I mean, that is sort of how these companies are constructed. They are meant to maximize shareholder profits. They're not meant to be secure. And so in order to change the incentives and how these companies operate, I do believe regulation may be required. And I was mentioning, NIS2 in Europe, that sort of, puts much more accountability on the board and the executives at the company, sort of that may go in the right direction. But then I also think there may be AI uplift, right? Previously, if you really wanted to get to a very good security stance, only very few companies could do it because you needed to be a software engineering company. You needed to have an executive team that is willing to pay for it. And you just couldn't hire the engineers because the skill set, was rare and everybody wanted it. But now I think that equation may be changing, but it's not really going to lead to any change unless the incentives on the companies change.
Yeah, you're spot on. I've had a guest on in the past named Jim Dempsey, who writes that Cyber Lawfare blog. And he kind of spoke about the concept of software liability as he called it cybersecurity's third rail, in the sense like it's politically polarizing, no one wants to touch it. And we did see that concept come about in previous publications from CISA and the previous presidential administration. Obviously, we're moving in a much more deregulatory motion now, but I'm curious to see how long that lasts or if it changes as administrations change in the United States here again and so on. But I agree with you. Like, cybersecurity has long been considered a market failure. People are not going to be incentivized to take action on their own to put security above things like speed to market and revenue and profitability and things like that. Like people are not going to altruistically do that. It's not how corporations operate. So I think it is going to take some regulatory force to change that dynamic. For someone that's hearing this phrase of security invariants, as you spoke about and wrote about, the core move you're making, like going from patching a given bug to making entire classes of bugs irrelevant, is there the way that the production environments cannot make arbitrary outbound calls and so on, like what exactly does that concept mean? How does it get implemented? And just as an aside, like it reminds me of something that I heard a lot from CISA, again, under Jen Easterly with folks like Bob Lord and Jack Cable and others. They were kind of advocating for eliminating entire classes of vulnerabilities. And you hear this a lot with the conversation around moving to memory-safe programming language and so on.
Yeah, I mean, Jen and Bob, they are great. And I think this notion of security invariance is not a new idea, right? We have been known how to do this for decades. It's just, people don't do it. I mean, Google was very, very good at building these. But the notion of a security invariant is basically some kind of infrastructure property guarantee that is systematically enforced without requiring any ongoing human judgment. And you had mentioned egress control. I still think if you worry about the exploitability of vulnerabilities that may be exposed, on your perimeter to the internet, egress control is sort of the way to go about that. And the idea is, with egress control, sort of any service in your production environment is allowed to egress to only well-known destinations. And I don't mean IP addresses, right? I mean, domains. And then if you put that in place, sort of most of the vulnerabilities out there, they don't give you a shell, right? Because they're sort of, very constrained in the way in which you can exercise them. But if you're lucky, you can get it to a place where you can download something from the internet and execute that. And then you sort of get your stage 2 payload, and that can turn sort of into a stage 3 where maybe you implant some persistence or whatnot, install a remote access Trojan. But, right, if you can't fetch your stage 2 download, then you're stuck, right? You can't fully complete that chain. And egress control is one of the ways in which you can prevent that, because the service that you're trying to exploit can maybe only go to, 2 or 3 destinations that you don't control. And for sure, you could make the argument, great, I'm just going to be, I don't know, what your dependency might be. Maybe a JavaScript library, maybe an RPC endpoint for, Twilio or something like that. You might say, well, I'm just going to compromise Twilio, and that is the way that I can sort of get my payload delivered. But then sort of the bar is just much, much higher. And, my fun story with that is Log4j, and I'm happy to tell it if you want to hear it.
Yeah, let's hear it. Let's go.
So this happened in December on a Thursday, and I had already started to do this cybersecurity themed EDM music, and I decided to take the Friday off. But I was head of security at Stripe, and we became aware of this vulnerability on a Thursday, but nobody really had any idea what it meant or what the implication was. And well, my plan was to have a 3-day weekend and do music production. And most people, when I talked to them, I said, "Oh, Niels, I'm so sorry. That was probably not what you got on the weekend." But the answer was no. I had a great weekend, full 3 days of music production. And as I got back to the office on Monday, my team, which was very good, had put an early morning debriefing meeting on my calendar. And they basically said, "Hey, Niels, we ran this incident, but we did not think we had to interrupt you because it was all in hand." And if you remember with Log4j, sort of almost any type of user data that got logged could be turned into a download of a malicious Java class from the internet that could get executed. But thanks to egress control, well, you couldn't download that malicious Java class. And it sort of, gave the teams much more time to remediate and patch and fix things without having to worry, oh my God, this is something that could be immediately exploited. So it was a
That's awesome.
huge win for one of these security invariants.
Yeah. The security invariants saved your 3-day weekend and your music endeavor.
That's
so
right,
that's
exactly.
Awesome. So, you've talked about this before when you talked about the role of AI uplifting, maybe because not every security team, of course, is like a Stripe or a Google or so on. Like they have workforce constraints and budgetary constraints and so on. But you've argued that AI assisted engineering can now do a lot of the heavy lifting. I'm curious, and we touched on this a little bit with the regulation piece, like if the technical barrier is gone, the blockers are kind of organizational at that point. Where do you think invariants kind of struggle inside large organizations, when it comes to competing priorities or missing incentive? If it isn't a capability gap per se, it's more now competing incentive where you're kind of getting into the people process aspect of the people process technology paradigm, right? And I've spent a lot of my time in large federal enterprise environments in my career. It's more so the people, the process, the competing incentives, the politics, things like that impede security outcomes more than technical capability per se.
Right. And so the sad answer is it doesn't change anything per se because the same incentives still apply. But, right, if we sort of see more focus on you have to do something about the vulnerabilities, it's conceivable that those incentives might shift a little bit. And in the past, the argument likely was this is an insurmountable problem because we just don't have the skill set to do this. And I think some of those arguments are getting eroded. So I think if you see just a slight shift in the incentives, it might make it possible for more companies to go down this path. But even with AI, this is not a free path. right? You still need somebody who at least conceptually understands what you're trying to accomplish. It sort of needs to be tailor-suited to the environment that you're in, right? The egress solution, for your organization may look very different to the egress solution for some other organization. And all of it comes with the maintenance burden that you can't get rid of, right? So you pay for it on an ongoing basis. And then the question is your company willing to pay for that? And then I think you also get into the people process, right? You may have heard sort of a lot of companies are sort of trying to force feed AI to their employees. And then you have seen sort of these token maxing trends, which just seem so stupid. But I think the problem is still, right? People are sort of very leery to change. Change is scary. It leads to a lot of fear. And unless you have an organization that has really great leadership, these cultural transformation is often very, very difficult to do.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that because I had given a talk at SANS's AI Security Summit earlier this year in DC. I think it was in April. And I touched on this, like your comment about being reluctant to change. I feel like there's, the crossing the chasm. I'm sure you've heard of it and seen it. Security is almost always a late adopter and a laggard because we're so risk averse. We're so, resistant to change and like, what if XYZ goes wrong? That kind of thing. To your notion of AI potentially being able to uplift to security engineering and so on, how do we do that if security as a culture is so resistant to new technology paradigms and new capabilities and change because we're so worried about disrupting something, breaking something being hacked and so on? Like, how do we get the security community to be an early adopter and innovator with this technology?
Chris, I fear it's even worse than that. In my mind, sort of a lot of humans, they're just change averse to begin with. Because any kind of change leads to uncertainty. It may lead to sort of some cognitive dissonance. It sort of requires you to be much more deliberate in what you do without really knowing what the outcome is going to be. And so if you think about a company as a system of autonomous agents, right, where every employee is sort of its own agent and they sort of operate on the incentives that they perceive, one of the incentives that most people will have is, I just want to feel comfortable. I just want to do what I did yesterday because I know how to do that. Don't ask me to do something new because it's scary. And that means that all of a sudden, sort of the push to change needs to be much stronger than otherwise. And then I think, and I don't know this, right? I'm just hypothesizing that. It's not clear to me that security organizations per se are more change averse. I mean, usually their role is to cause change in other horizontal organizations around them. So they may actually be much more equipped for change than anybody else because they ask for change all the time. I mean, that said, you still end up in a situation where you have a CISO and the only thing the CISO can do is buy third-party security tools and then sort of, staff people who do the triage of what these tools provide, right? They may not have a lot of maneuvering room, but even then, right, the triage process and I now have to go to some other team and ask them to do work might make those organizations more acceptable to change.
Yeah, that makes sense. You use the word buy, which made me think of another debate that's been kind of raging in the community is the build versus buy argument. Some are arguing now with AI and agentic coding, teams can build their own capabilities, right, rather than buying them. How do you think of that? I think it's a nuanced answer. Yes, you can, but also there's a lot of other considerations of maintaining it, sustaining it, et cetera. You don't get SLAs. You don't have a vendor to blame. There's a lot of give and take in that. How do you think of the build versus buy paradigm in the age of AI? Same with open source, where things now can be kind of built easily or trivially.
Chris, I'm very biased. And in my mind, if you don't treat security as an engineering problem, you're not likely to succeed. And, part of the problem is most of these third-party security service, they give you point solutions, right? They try to make one particular thing better, but that is actually not how security works, right? Security is a whole systems problem. And I still land on you need these security invariants. And the security invariants need to be part of your infrastructure. And that is not something that any of these security services are going to be providing to you. I mean, I'm not saying don't use them, but they can't be the foundation of your security program.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And it kind of made me think of, take us in another direction in some way, but the security ecosystem as a whole is and you've been around this a long time. Like, I feel like that's how the ecosystem works though. Like these point products come about, they do something differentiated or slightly better than a platform incumbent. And they try to, create a niche in the industry, but then they, sometimes get gobbled up by the platform companies who have to try to integrate them. And, it seems like a cyclical endeavor. And of course, like the VCs and capital is what funds these point solutions and startups. I don't know if I see any of that changing, and I'm not being cynical, but I feel like it's the way the entire cybersecurity ecosystem works. They don't think of it in the way that you just framed it as a systems problem. Like they're trying to deliver some differentiated capability to the market, get a foothold, get capital, get acquired. And maybe it's not even a question; it's more of a rant. But I'm just
fair
curious your
enough.
thoughts on that.
I don't disagree with you, but I think it comes back to what are the incentives, right? Can we create incentives that actually empower CISOs to sort of pursue lasting and principled solutions? And maybe, right, in Europe with NIS2, maybe that will sort of lead to reevaluation of are we just giving our security organization a budget to, buy third-party tools and then, staff a few analysts to sort of, go through them every day? Or are we now in a position where sort of the risk that we perceive for our own accountability for being negligent actually changes the perspective where we say, hey, you security organization, we will actually allow you to have engineers. We will actually allow those engineers to work with our infrastructure teams, to build something that is better. But look, I mean, lots and lots of companies are not engineering companies, right? They live by cobbling together legacy systems and sort of packaging up into something that can be sold as provided as a business service. And a lot of transformation is going to be needed to change the equation for those companies.
I was going to say, I agree with you. And I don't know if you know Travis McPeak of Cursor, but he had given a talk at an event I was at recently where he talked about security kind of historically just creates work for others in the organization, other teams, other or business units, et cetera. And he was the whole theme of his talk was like, go out and take ownership and control of these things. And like you said, approach it from an engineering mindset and go about solving problems. And the way you're kind of framing your perspective reminds me of what he was saying. I wanted to ask you last question perhaps for you before I cut you loose here. Looking out a couple of years, knowing that you've been in this space for a long time, you're watching the rise of LLMs and agentic AI, et cetera. Like if offense and defense both get the same cheap orchestratable AI, who do you think actually comes out ahead? And, what should maybe policymakers and security leaders be doing now that none of them are doing quite yet? Or maybe isn't it being applied as well as it could be?
I find it so hard to make any prediction about the future at the moment. It sort of seems that it changes so quickly right now. But I think, where I will sort of keep repeating myself like a broken record player, it's not the technology, it's the incentives. We have to fix the incentives if we want to see, better outcomes in the security space. But I mean, to sort of, try to answer your question sort of a little bit more directly, defense usually tends to be much more expensive, because the adversaries have the benefit that they can pick where they want to attack you, whereas you as a defender, you have to defend it all. And, one of the things that I really wonder about, are we ever going to get to a place where we can actually measure security? And, this really stupid example that I have is that say you have a house with 10 doors and you lock 9 of them, are you now 90% secure? Right? And the answer is no. You have an intelligent adversary. They're going to be going through the 10th door that is not locked. And in companies that have sort of approached how can we measure our state of security, they would usually treat it as some kind of adversarial simulation, right? They would have a team of, very capable security engineers. These security engineers would adopt the TTPs of a known sort of nation state actor and sort of try to break into the company, go after a goal. And, what you would end up doing is you would see, do they succeed? Do we detect them? How quickly do we detect them? How quickly can we detain them? And to the best of my knowledge, that is sort of still the best way for you to really get a sense of the, what's our resilience to these kind of security events. But it is possible that, if the AI has become so capable that you can run these kind of adversarial simulations all the time, it might get you to a place where you have a much better understanding of your weaknesses. And I think, the other thing that may also be possible is as you end up deploying these security invariants, can we have an ongoing assessment of, are they in place? Are they still working? How broadly are they deployed? And those two things taken together, I think might get us to a place where as a defender, you have a much, much better sense of your weak spots and sort of your overall security stance. That said, right, I mean, everything I just talked about still requires you to be a software engineering company.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing this kind of theme that you just touched on, that shift from periodic snapshot in time type assessments and evaluations to more continuous near real time assessments with the use of AI. I'm seeing that kind of start to come across in GRC, start to come across in offensive security, red teaming, et cetera.
Right.
So I think there's a real opportunity there. And I will say, just like last comment for me, I had never spoken to you before, and I know you were an exceptionally talented and technical person, but it was really cool to hear that your framing kept coming back to the people, the incentives, the behavior. Even as someone who's really technical in codes and has been deep in the weeds, I feel like you look systemically at the environment, the ecosystem, the industry, and realize that it often comes back to people, behavior, and incentives. So that was super cool to hear personally.
And it is sort of sad because I like to think about myself as a technologist, but technology isn't really the solution. We know how to solve all of these problems. There's sort of no rocket science here.
Awesome. Well, I'll close us there. Thank you so much for jumping on here with me, Niels. I appreciate it, and look forward to following your further writing and kind of thought leadership in this space.
Yeah, sounds good, Chris. This was fun.
Absolutely. Take care.